Racist police officer accuses black man of stealing a car, not knowing he is the state attorney. Sir, step out of the vehicle. Hands where I can see them. James Carter, dressed in a crisp suit, calmly exited the black sedan parked at the side of a quiet suburban street. The officer's hand hovered near his holstered gun. James raised his hand slowly, confusion etched on his face. Whose car is this? Where did you steal it? The officer barked. James furrowed his brow, glancing at the car he had been driving for 3 years. Officer, this is my car, he replied evenly. The officer, a middle-aged man with a rigid stance and an air of authority, scoffed. Right. And I'm supposed to believe you can afford something like this. James stayed composed but felt a flicker of anger. Why didn't you run the plates or check my ID? The officer ignored him, walking around the car like a predator circling prey. You people think you can just take what you want, he muttered loud enough to be heard. The moment was tense. A crowd began to form, whispering and recording with their phones. James's jaw tightened. This was escalating fast. He took a deep breath, then spoke in a calm but firm tone. I'm James Carter, state attorney for this district. You're making a mistake. The officer froze mid-step, his expression shifting from indignation to disbelief. What did you say? I said I'm the state attorney. The officer's eyes widened slightly, though he quickly masked his surprise. His grip on his belt tightened. For a moment, time seemed to stop as the weight of his mistake settled in. The crowd murmured louder, some voices rising with outrage. What happens now? Earlier that day, James woke up in his spacious home, preparing for another busy day. The house was filled with warmth and laughter as his young daughter, Emily, ran into his bedroom holding her favorite stuffed bear. Daddy, are you coming to my recital tonight? She asked with wide, hopeful eyes. Wouldn't miss it for the world, James replied, lifting her into his arms. His wife, Claire, appeared in the doorway with a smile. Don't forget, you promised to be home early. James kissed Claire's cheek and assured her he would. The family enjoyed a quick breakfast together before James grabbed his briefcase and headed to the garage. His sleek black sedan was a recent upgrade, something he'd gifted himself after a long string of successful cases. As he drove through the city, his mind drifted to his court schedule. Today was supposed to be routine. But as he turned onto a suburban street to meet a colleague for lunch, the flash of blue lights in his rearview mirror caught him off guard. License and registration, the officer had demanded when he approached the driver's side window. James handed over his documents without protest. The officer scanned them briefly, then frowned. Step out of the car, he ordered. James had asked, Is there a problem, officer? The officer's response was sharp. Just do as I say. Confused but cooperative, James stepped out. That's when the accusations began, leading to the confrontation now unfolding in front of the gathering crowd. The officer's mistake wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was a reflection of something deeper and more troubling. But in this moment, all eyes were on James, the officer, and the unspoken tension thick in the air. The officer shifted uncomfortably. Let's verify your story, he said, pulling out his radio. James didn't move, his expression calm but unyielding. I suggest you do that quickly. And while you're at it, call your supervisor. The crowd grew larger, their murmurs turning into sharp commentary. Is this really happening? Someone asked. James kept his gaze locked on the officer, his calm exterior hiding the storm inside. This wasn't just about him. It was about every assumption, every prejudice, every injustice that had led to this moment. The officer hesitated, his radio still in his hand. His confidence was visibly shaken, but he tried to maintain control. James stood tall, knowing this was far from over. The next move would define everything that happened next. And then, just as the officer seemed ready to speak, another police car pulled up, lights flashing. The crowd shifted, anticipation crackling in the air. The situation was spiraling, and everyone knew it. The second patrol car came to a halt, and a tall officer with a commanding presence stepped out. His uniform was neatly pressed, his demeanor calm but authoritative. He surveyed the scene for a moment, taking in the murmuring crowd, the tense officer, and James standing near his car. "Officer Daniels," the senior officer called out, addressing the first officer. "What's going on here?" Daniels straightened up, his discomfort momentarily masked by the presence of his superior. "Stopped a suspect in a potentially stolen vehicle, sir. He claims to be the state attorney." The senior officer, whose badge read Lieutenant Roberts, turned his attention to James. He gave him a once-over, his expression neutral but inquisitive. "And you are?" Roberts asked, his tone measured. "James Carter, state attorney for this district," James replied, his voice steady. "And I'd like to know why I was pulled over and accused of stealing my own car." Roberts' eyes flicked to Daniels, who shifted uneasily. "You ran his plates." Daniels stammered, suddenly aware of the glaring omission in his actions. Roberts frowned. "You didn't verify the registration." "No, sir. But—" "Enough," Roberts cut him off, raising a hand to silence the excuse. He turned back to James. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for this. Let me sort this out immediately." Before James could respond, a voice from the crowd shouted, "Apologize? Is that all he gets? What about accountability?" The crowd's frustration began to bubble over, their comments growing louder and angrier. Phones were still recording, and the tension was palpable. James held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "I appreciate the apology, Lieutenant," James said firmly. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the systemic issues that lead to situations like this. I need to know this will be addressed properly." Roberts nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "I assure you it will be. Officer Daniels, hand me the registration you collected." Daniels reluctantly handed over the papers. Roberts scanned them quickly, his expression tightening as he realized James had been telling the truth all along. "This car is registered to Mr. Carter," Roberts said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. There was no reason for this stop. The crowd murmured in agreement, some shouting, "We knew it," and racial profiling at its finest. Daniels' face flushed, his earlier bravado replaced by visible embarrassment. Roberts addressed James directly. "Mr. Carter, again, I deeply regret this incident. I'll be filing a report and Officer Daniels will be held accountable." James nodded, though his mind was already racing. The situation was far from over. This wasn't just an isolated case of poor judgment. It was part of a much larger problem. Before anyone could say another word, a woman's voice pierced through the noise. "Is everything okay, sir?" It was Claire, James's wife, hurrying toward the scene with their daughter, Emily, in tow. She had apparently seen the commotion as she drove by. James's heart sank. The last thing he wanted was for his family to witness this, but it was too late. Emily clung to her mother, her wide eyes reflecting confusion and fear. "It's fine, Claire," James said gently, walking over to them. "Just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Claire echoed, her voice sharp with disbelief. "They pulled you over and accused you of stealing your own car." Emily tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, are they mad at you?" she asked softly. James crouched down to her level, his expression softening. "No, sweetie. Everything's okay now." But was it really? As James comforted his daughter, the crowd began to disperse, though some lingered, still recording and discussing what had happened. Roberts spoke quietly to Daniels, whose face was a mask of shame and frustration. The damage had been done, and everyone knew it. James stood, holding Emily's hand. He turned to Roberts. "Lieutenant, I expect a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning, and I want to see real steps taken to address this." "You have my word," Roberts replied earnestly. James gave a curt nod, then turned to his family. "Let's go home." They walked back to the car, but the weight of the incident hung heavily in the air. James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The world had seen what happened, and now the question was how it would respond. As he drove away, his mind raced with questions. What would this mean for his career? For his family? And most importantly, how could he turn this moment into an opportunity for real change? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain: this story wasn't over. Just as they reached their neighborhood, James's phone buzzed. It was a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mr. Carter," a stern voice said on the other end, "we need to talk about what happened today. Meet me first thing in the morning." James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his pulse quickening. Who was this? And what did they want? James stared at his phone for a moment, the voice on the other end still lingering in his mind. The tone had been firm, almost urgent, but the caller hadn't identified themselves. He glanced at Claire, who was watching him closely from the passenger seat. "Who was that?" she asked. "I'm not sure," James replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "Someone wants to meet tomorrow morning about what happened." Claire's brow furrowed. "Do you think it's related to the officer? Or something bigger?" James didn't answer right away. He didn't want to speculate, especially not in front of Emily, who was humming softly in the back seat, seemingly oblivious to the tension. When they arrived home, James went through the motions of their evening routine: dinner, homework, and Emily's bedtime story, but his mind was elsewhere. After Emily was tucked in, he joined Claire in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, her worry evident. "James, this isn't just going to go away," she said. "That officer didn't just make a mistake. He assumed you were a criminal because of how you look." "I know," James said, sinking into the chair across from her. "But it's not just about me. It's about the system that allows this to happen over and over again." Claire nodded, her eyes sharp. "So what are you going to do about it?" James exhaled slowly. "First, I need to figure out who called me and why. Then I need to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. If I have to use my position to make noise, so be it." Claire leaned forward, her voice low but intense. "Just promise me one thing. Don't let them silence you. You've worked too hard to get where you are." James nodded, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. Who had called him? A journalist? A community leader? Or someone higher up in law enforcement? He knew he wouldn't get any answers tonight, so he decided to try and get some rest. The next morning, James arrived at his office earlier than usual. His assistant, Monica, greeted him with a concerned look. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. Are you okay?" she asked, her tone tentative. "I'm fine," James replied, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Has anyone been trying to reach me?" Monica hesitated. "Actually, yes. A lot of reporters have been calling since last night. And there's a man waiting in your office. He said it was urgent." James's pulse quickened. "Did he say who he is?" "No, but he mentioned the incident yesterday." James nodded, taking a deep breath before pushing open the door to his office. A man in a dark suit stood by the window, his back to the door. He turned as James entered, revealing a sharp, weathered face. His badge, clipped to his belt, identified him as an agent with internal affairs. "Mr. Carter," the man said, extending a hand. "Agent Russell. Thanks for meeting me." James shook his hand, his expression guarded. "I didn't realize I had much of a choice." Russell gave a small, humorless smile. "Fair enough. Let's cut to the chase. Yesterday's incident has sparked a lot of attention. Videos of the stop are already going viral, and there's pressure coming from all sides." James crossed his arms. "Pressure to do what? Sweep it under the rug?" Russell shook his head. "Quite the opposite. The department wants to show they're taking this seriously. Officer Daniels is under investigation, and there's talk of implementing new training protocols. But there's something else you need to know." James narrowed his eyes. "What?" Russell stepped closer, his voice lowering. "This wasn't random. Daniels didn't just pull you over because he thought you looked suspicious. He had your car flagged." James's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "There's someone in the department who doesn't like you," Russell said bluntly. "They wanted to embarrass you, or worse." James's mind raced. "Do you know who?" "We're working on it," Russell said. But whoever it is, they're connected. This wasn't just about you driving a nice car. It was personal. James sat down, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to be careful, Russell said. Whoever's behind this isn't just targeting you. They're trying to send a message. And if you're not careful, yesterday's incident will be the least of your worries. James leaned back, his jaw tightening. So what do you suggest I do? Stay visible, Russell said. Make it harder for them to come after you quietly. And if you find out anything, call me. He handed James a card before walking to the door. One more thing, Russell said, turning back. Don't trust anyone in uniform unless you know them personally. This goes deeper than one bad cop. As the door closed behind him, James stared at the card in his hand. His resolve hardened. This wasn't just about clearing his name or holding one officer accountable. It was about uncovering the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and mounting media attention. James gave a brief statement to the press, condemning the officer's actions and calling for systemic reforms. The response was overwhelming, both support from the community and backlash from those who saw him as a troublemaker. By the time James got home, he was exhausted but determined. Claire was waiting for him in the kitchen, her face a mix of relief and concern. How was your day? She asked. Complicated, James replied. He told her about Agent Russell's visit, leaving nothing out. Claire's face paled. James, this is serious. If someone's targeting you... I know, James said, cutting her off gently. But I can't back down. If I do, they win. Claire nodded, though her worry was evident. Just promise me you'll be careful. I will, James said, pulling her into a hug. But as he held her, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse. That night, James was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. He jumped out of bed, his heart pounding. Claire sat up beside him, her eyes wide with fear. What was that? She whispered. James grabbed his phone and dialed 911 as he crept toward the living room. When he reached the hallway, he froze. The front window was shattered and a brick lay on the floor. Attached to it was a note scrawled in red ink. Stay silent, or you'll regret it. James' blood ran cold. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing games. They were sending a warning, and it was clear they were willing to escalate. James stood frozen, staring at the brick and the note on the floor. His breathing was shallow, and his mind raced with questions. Claire came up behind him, her hand gripping his arm tightly. What does it say? She asked, her voice trembling. James hesitated, not wanting to scare her further, but he knew there was no point in hiding the truth. He handed her the note. Claire read it quickly, her face paling as her grip on his arm tightened. We need to call the police, she said firmly. James grimaced. And how do I know they won't be the ones behind this? Claire looked at him, her fear turning into frustration. James, we can't just do nothing. Whoever did this isn't going to stop. The sound of Emily's voice interrupted them. Mommy? Daddy? What's going on? She stood at the top of the stairs, clutching her bear and rubbing her eyes. Claire quickly composed herself. Nothing, sweetie. Go back to bed. We'll come check on you in a minute. Emily nodded sleepily and disappeared back into her room. James exhaled deeply, then picked up his phone and dialed 911. It was a decision he didn't take lightly, but he couldn't risk ignoring the threat. The operator answered quickly. 911, what's your emergency? This is James Carter, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. Someone just threw a brick through my window. There's a note attached. We'll dispatch officers to your location immediately, the operator replied. Stay inside, lock your doors, and wait for help. James hung up and turned to Claire. Let's get Emily and wait upstairs. Within minutes, 2 squad cars arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the quiet street. James watched from the upstairs window, his heart heavy with distrust. Claire stayed close to Emily, who had fallen asleep again on their bed. A knock at the door made James tense. He walked downstairs cautiously, glancing at the shattered window as he approached the door. When he opened it, he was greeted by a pair of uniformed officers. "Mr. Carter?" one of them asked. "That's me," James replied. His eyes scanned their badges, noting their names. Officer Green and Officer Ramirez. "We're here to investigate the incident," Green said, stepping inside. His tone was professional, but James couldn't ignore the unease he felt. James led them to the living room, pointing to the brick and the note. Green crouched down to examine them while Ramirez took notes. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Green asked. James hesitated. "I received a warning earlier today from an agent in Internal Affairs. He said someone in law enforcement might be targeting me." The officers exchanged a quick glance, their expressions carefully neutral. "We'll make a report and collect evidence," Ramirez said. "But if this is connected to law enforcement, it might complicate things." James crossed his arms. "Complicate things? Someone broke into my home and threatened my family. I don't care how complicated it gets." "We understand, Mr. Carter," Green said, standing up. "But if this goes deeper than a random act, we need to be thorough." James wasn't satisfied, but he nodded. He watched as the officers bagged the brick and the note, then promised to follow up. As they left, Green paused at the door. "Be careful," he said. "If you think you're being watched, don't hesitate to call us." James nodded curtly, closing the door behind them. He stood there for a moment, his thoughts churning. He didn't know whether to trust their concern or see it as another smokescreen. The next morning, James met Agent Russell again, this time in a public cafe at his request. He recounted the events of the previous night, showing him a photo of the note he'd taken before handing it over to the officers. Russell's expression darkened as he read the message. "This isn't just a warning," he said grimly. "It's a declaration." "What does that mean?" James asked, his frustration evident. "It means they're not just trying to scare you. They're daring you to act. They want you to know they're watching, and they're confident you won't fight back." James leaned forward, his jaw tight. "Well, they're wrong. I'm not backing down." Russell nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Good. But you need to understand what you're up against. If someone within law enforcement is targeting you, they have access to resources, information, and people who can cover for them." "So what do I do?" James asked. "Stay vocal," Russell replied. "Keep the spotlight on you. The more public this gets, the harder it'll be for them to act without consequences." James nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then I need to make a statement. Not just about what happened to me, but about the broader issues. People need to know this isn't just one bad cop. It's a system that needs to change." Russell smiled faintly. "That's a good start. But be careful, James. These people won't go down without a fight." That afternoon, James held a press conference outside his office. The media swarmed, their cameras and microphones trained on him. James stood tall, his suit immaculate, his voice steady. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," he began. "It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that affects countless people every day. Racial profiling, abuse of power, and systemic injustice are issues we can't ignore. I'm not just speaking as someone who was wronged. I'm speaking as someone who has the power to demand change." The crowd murmured in agreement, their cameras capturing every word. "I'm calling for an independent investigation into the practices of our law enforcement agencies," James continued. "And I won't stop until we see real accountability." The crowd erupted into applause, but James knew this was only the beginning. As he stepped away from the podium, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You've made your move. Now it's our turn." James's stomach clenched. The fight had just escalated, and the stakes had never been higher. James stared at the cryptic text message on his phone. The words were simple but chilling. Claire's face appeared in his mind, then Emily's. He quickly locked the phone and shoved it into his pocket, masking his unease as reporters shouted more questions. "Mr. Carter, do you believe your family is in danger? Do you think law enforcement will retaliate? Who's behind this? James raised a hand, signaling the end of the conference. I've said all I need to say for now, thank you. His security detail escorted him back into the building, shielding him from the pressing crowd. As soon as the door closed behind him, James exhaled sharply. Monica approached, her face filled with concern. Are you all right? She asked. I'm fine, James replied, though his clenched fists betrayed him. Any updates from the police? They called while you were out there, Monica said. They want to schedule a meeting with you and the mayor to discuss your statement. James nodded. Set it up. The sooner, the better. That evening, James sat at the dinner table with Claire and Emily, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. Emily chatted about her day at school, unaware of the tension between her parents. Claire had said little since the press conference, her worry evident in her furrowed brow and quiet demeanor. Emily, Claire said finally, her voice gentle, why don't you finish your homework in the living room? Daddy and I need to talk. Emily looked between them but nodded, grabbing her workbook and skipping out of the room. As soon as she was gone, Claire turned to James. What was that text you got after the press conference? She asked, her tone sharp. James hesitated. He had hoped she hadn't noticed, but Claire was nothing if not observant. It was another threat, he admitted. Her face tightened. What did it say? James repeated the message. Claire's knuckles turned white as she gripped her napkin. This isn't just about you anymore, James, she said. They're targeting all of us. You need to think about what's best for Emily. James leaned forward, his voice low but firm. I am thinking about her. The only way to protect her, protect all of us, is to fight back. If I back down now, they win. Claire shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. And if you don't back down, they could do something worse than throw a brick through our window. James reached across the table, taking her hand. I promise I won't let that happen. How can you promise that? She whispered. James didn't have an answer. The following morning, James sat in the mayor's office, flanked by Agent Russell and Lieutenant Roberts. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Mayor Susan Blake, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, looked directly at James. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Mr. Carter, she said bluntly. The press is hounding us, community groups are demanding action, and the police department is on edge. Good, James replied. It means people are paying attention. Blake leaned back in her chair, studying him. You've made your point, but this needs to be handled carefully. If we're too aggressive, it could damage public trust in law enforcement. James's temper flared. Public trust is already damaged. What happened to me is proof of that. Russell intervened, his tone measured. We need to strike a balance. A thorough investigation, but one that doesn't appear biased. James shook his head. No, this isn't the time for half measures. People need to see that we're serious about accountability. Blake sighed, clearly torn. I'll support an independent task force, but it'll take time to organize. James wasn't satisfied, but he knew this was as much as he could push for now. Make it happen. As the meeting ended, Russell pulled James aside. Watch your back, he said. Whoever sent that text is playing the long game. They'll wait for the right moment. James nodded grimly. I'll be ready. Later that night, James sat in his study, going through case files when his phone rang. The caller ID displayed another unknown number. He hesitated but answered. Carter, he said. Mr. Carter, a deep voice replied. I hear you're making waves. James's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? That's not important, the voice said. What matters is you're stepping into dangerous territory. You've got a family to think about. Do you really want to put them at risk? James's jaw clenched. If you think you can intimidate me, you're wasting your time. The voice chuckled darkly. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But let's see how brave you are when the stakes get higher. The line went dead. James sat back, his pulse racing. He stared at the phone, the threat echoing in his mind. He knew he had crossed a line, but there was no turning back now. At 2 a.m., James was jolted awake by the blaring of the house alarm. Claire sat up beside him, panic in her eyes. "What's happening?" she asked. James grabbed his phone and checked the security app. The motion sensor in the backyard had been triggered. He quickly pulled on a rope and headed downstairs, his heart pounding. Claire followed, holding Emily close. When he reached the kitchen, he peeked out the window. In the glow of the backyard floodlights, he saw a figure darting away, disappearing into the darkness. His phone buzzed with a notification from the security camera. James opened the app and watched the playback. The figure had approached the back door, paused for a moment, then placed something on the doorstep before running off. "What did they leave?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. James opened the door cautiously, his eyes scanning the yard. On the step was a small black box. A note was taped to the top. "You were warned." James swallowed hard and opened the box, revealing a single bullet inside. Claire gasped, clutching Emily tighter. "James, we have to leave. This is too much." James stared at the bullet, his hands trembling. The message was clear. They weren't bluffing. But running wasn't an option. Not anymore. James stared at the bullet in the black box, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the weight of the threat. The air in the house felt suffocating. He closed the box and placed it on the kitchen counter, turning to Claire. "Take Emily upstairs," he said quietly. "Lock the door. I'll handle this." Claire's eyes brimmed with tears, her fear now mingled with frustration. "You can't keep saying you'll handle it, James. This isn't just about you anymore." "I know," James replied, his voice firm. "That's why I need you to trust me." She hesitated but nodded, taking Emily by the hand and heading upstairs. Once they were gone, James grabbed his phone and dialed Agent Russell. Russell picked up on the second ring. "Carter, it's late. What's going on?" "They escalated," James said, his voice low. "Someone left a bullet on my doorstep with a note. I've got the whole thing on my security cameras." Russell swore under his breath. "Are you sure the house is secure?" "I think so. But this isn't just a scare tactic anymore. They're serious." "Send me the footage," Russell said. "I'll have someone analyze it. In the meantime, I'm sending a team to your house. Don't go outside. And keep your family safe." James hung up and forwarded the video to Russell, his hands shaking slightly. He walked through the house, double-checking every lock and window, his senses on high alert. The faint sound of Claire soothing Emily upstairs tugged at his heart, but he forced himself to stay focused. 20 minutes later, 2 unmarked cars pulled into the driveway. 4 plainclothes officers stepped out, their movements swift and purposeful. James opened the door cautiously as they approached. "Agent Russell sent us," one of them said, flashing a badge. "We're here to secure the premises." James nodded and let them in. The officers spread out, inspecting the house and yard. One of them carefully bagged the black box and bullet for evidence. Another officer reviewed the security footage with James. This person knew exactly where the cameras were, the officer said, pausing the video. They avoided looking directly at them, but their gait and height might give us something to work with. "Do you think they'll come back?" James asked. The officer didn't answer directly. "We're setting up surveillance around the house. If they do, we'll be ready." The next morning, James woke to the sound of Claire talking quietly on the phone in the kitchen. He joined her, and she quickly ended the call, her expression tense. "Who was that?" he asked. "My sister," Claire said. "I was asking if Emily and I could stay with her for a while." James's stomach sank. "Claire." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "You keep saying you'll protect us, but how can you promise that when they're leaving bullets at our door? I can't risk Emily's safety." James nodded slowly, his chest tight with guilt. "If you think it's best, I won't stop you. But I'll keep fighting this." Claire placed a hand on his arm. "I know you will, just don't forget what you're fighting for." After Claire and Emily left, the house felt eerily quiet. James threw himself into his work, determined to keep moving forward. The footage from the backyard had been inconclusive, but Russell assured him the investigation was progressing. As the day wore on, James received a call from Monica. "Mr. Carter, there's someone here asking to speak with you. She says she has information about the threats." James frowned. "Who is she?" "She didn't give a name, but she's insistent. Should I send her away?" "No," James said after a moment. "Bring her to my office." A few minutes later, Monica escorted a young woman into the office. She was dressed in plain clothes, her face pale but determined. She glanced around nervously before sitting across from James. "My name is Leela," she said quietly. "I'm a dispatcher for the police department." James' eyes narrowed. "What brings you here, Leela?" She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I'd overheard something I wasn't supposed to. A group of officers talking about you. They said you're making too much noise and that someone needs to shut you up." James felt a chill run through him. "Do you know who they were?" "I recognized two of them," Leela admitted. "Officer Daniels and Sergeant Miller. But there were others I didn't know." James clenched his fists. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's wrong," Leela said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to be part of it, and I don't want anyone to get hurt. But you need to be careful. They're planning something." James leaned back, his mind racing. "Do you have proof?" "Anything I can use." Leela shook her head. "I'm sorry. I just heard the conversation. But I thought you should know." James nodded, his respect for her courage growing. "Thank you, Leela. You did the right thing." As she left, James picked up his phone and called Russell. "We've got names," he said, "and I think it's worse than we thought." That night, James sat in his study, piecing together everything he knew. The threats, the brick, the bullet, and now Leela's testimony. It all pointed to a coordinated effort to silence him. But why? Was it about his recent casework or something deeper? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires screeching outside. He rushed to the window and saw two cars speeding away, their taillights disappearing into the night. On the lawn, a fire blazed, illuminating the dark sky. James ran outside, coughing as the smoke hit his lungs. The fire had engulfed a crude effigy, a mannequin dressed in a suit with a photo of James's face taped to it. His blood ran cold as he noticed the words spray-painted on the ground nearby. "Last warning." James stared at the fire, the heat licking at his skin. The stakes had just risen again. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for his life. The flames danced against the night sky as James stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the burning effigy. The message was clear. They weren't bluffing. His neighbors began gathering on their porches, their murmurs a distant hum beneath the crackling fire. "Mr. Carter, are you okay?" A man called from across the street. James didn't answer. He turned on his heel, rushed back into the house, and grabbed his phone. He dialed Agent Russell, his fingers trembling as he punched the numbers. "Russell," the agent answered, his voice groggy. "It was past midnight." "They just left another message," James said, his voice taut. "They set a fire on my lawn. A mannequin dressed like me, with my photo on it. And a message. Last warning." Russell cursed. "Are you safe? Is anyone hurt?" "I'm fine," James replied, though his heart pounded with adrenaline. "Claire and Emily aren't here. I sent them to her sister's house." "Good," Russell said. "I'm sending a team. Stay inside until we get there." Within 15 minutes, the street was flooded with flashing lights. Firefighters extinguished the smoldering remains while law enforcement officers combed through the yard, taking photos and bagging evidence. Russell arrived in an unmarked car, his face etched with concern. "This is escalating fast," Russell said as he approached James. "Whoever's behind this isn't just trying to scare you anymore. They're provoking you." James nodded, his jaw tight. "They think I'll back down. They're wrong." Russell sighed. "That's exactly what they're counting on. They want you to react emotionally, to make a mistake." James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "What do we do now?" Russell gestured toward the house. "Let's talk inside." Once they were seated in the living room, Russell leaned forward, his tone grave. "I've got some news, and you're not going to like it." "Let's hear it," James said. "We traced the bullet from last night," Russell began. "It was standard issue, the kind used by law enforcement." James's stomach dropped. "So it's someone on the inside." "Almost certainly," Russell said. "We're looking into Officer Daniels and Sergeant Miller, based on what your source told you. But they're not acting alone. This is bigger than a couple of bad cops." James ran a hand over his face. "What about the cameras? Did they catch anything tonight?" "Only the cars leaving the scene," Russell said. "But the plates were stolen." James leaned back, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "So we have nothing." "We have enough to know you're in real danger," Russell said. "You need to leave this house. Now." James shook his head. "If I run, they win." "This isn't about winning," Russell said sharply. "It's about staying alive. Let us handle the investigation. You can keep fighting, but you need to do it from a safe place." James hesitated, his pride and determination warring with his fear for his family. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but I'm not disappearing. People need to see that I'm not afraid." Russell nodded. "I'll arrange for a secure location. Pack what you need." By dawn, James was relocated to a safe house, a modest apartment in an undisclosed location, guarded around the clock. It felt strange to be away from his home, his routine, but he knew it was the right decision. Claire and Emily were still safely tucked away at her sister's, though James missed them terribly. He spent the day poring over case files, searching for connections that might explain why he'd been targeted. His recent prosecutions had involved a string of high-profile corruption cases, including several that implicated police officers. Could one of those cases be the root of all this? As he sifted through the files, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert. Local attorney James Carter targeted in series of threats. Investigation ongoing. James opened the article, which detailed the brick, the bullet, and the fire. The comments were a mix of support and vitriol. Some praised him for standing up to corruption, while others accused him of being anti-police. A new comment appeared at the top of the thread. "Carter won't last much longer. Watch and see." James' blood ran cold. He screenshotted the comment and sent it to Russell, who replied almost immediately, "We're tracking this. Don't engage." That evening, as James sat alone in the safe house, his phone rang. The caller ID showed another unknown number. His pulse quickened as he debated whether to answer. Finally, he picked up. "Carter," he said. "I see you found a little hideout," the voice on the other end said, cold and mocking. "Smart move." James's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter," the voice replied. "What matters is you're still alive for now." James's anger flared. "You think you can scare me? You're nothing but a coward." The voice chuckled. "Coward? Maybe. But cowards can be dangerous, especially when they have nothing to lose." The line went dead. James sat in the silence, his heart pounding. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he couldn't back down. The fight was bigger than him now, and he was determined to see it through. The next morning, James woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. It was Russell. "We've got a break," Russell said. "One of our informants came forward. They've got information about a meeting tonight." "A meeting?" James asked. "A group of officers. They've been planning their next move," Russell said. "If we can catch them in the act, we might be able to shut this down." James's adrenaline surged. "What's the plan?" Russell hesitated. "I shouldn't even be telling you this, but I thought you'd want to know. Stay out of it, Carter. Let us handle it." James clenched his jaw. "I appreciate the update, but this is my fight too." "Don't do anything reckless," Russell warned. "We'll keep you in the loop." James hung up, his mind racing. He couldn't just sit by and wait. If tonight was the night to expose the truth, he needed to be ready. As the sun set, James stood by the window, watching the shadows grow longer. The safe house felt like a prison, and he knew he wouldn't be able to stay there. Not tonight. It was time to take matters into his own hands. The dim glow of the setting sun painted the safe house in muted hues, but James's resolve burned brightly within him. He couldn't stay hidden while others risked their lives to expose the truth. This was his fight as much as anyone else's, and he wasn't about to sit it out. He packed a bag with essentials, his phone, documents, and a discreet recording device Russell had provided for emergencies. Slipping on a dark jacket, he stepped out into the cool evening air, careful to avoid the guards stationed outside. They were there to protect him, but tonight, he needed to move unnoticed. James parked a few blocks away from the location Russell had hinted at, a desolate warehouse on the outskirts of town. The area was eerily quiet, the hum of distant traffic the only sound. His heart raced as he approached, keeping to the shadows. He spotted a cluster of cars parked outside the warehouse, all unmarked but suspiciously uniform in their make and model. He recognized one of them immediately. It was Officer Daniels's vehicle. James's suspicions were confirmed. This was the meeting. He crouched behind a stack of crates near the entrance, his recording device in hand. He adjusted it, ensuring it was on and ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. Inside, voices echoed in the cavernous space, their tone low and conspiratorial. James crept closer, peering through a crack in the weathered steel door. He saw a group of men standing in a loose circle, their faces partially obscured by the dim light of a single hanging bulb. Daniels was among them, his posture tense but animated as he spoke. Beside him was Sergeant Miller, his bulk intimidating even in the dim light. A few others stood with them, their faces unfamiliar but their body language unmistakably hostile. "This isn't working," Daniels said, his voice sharp. "Carter's not scared. If anything, he's doubling down." "We gave him enough warnings," Miller growled. "He should have backed off by now." "And yet, here we are," Daniels shot back. "He's got the media on his side, the community behind him, and internal affairs sniffing around. We can't just sit on our hands." One of the others spoke up, his voice calm but cold. "If warnings won't work, we escalate. Permanently." James felt a chill run down his spine. He leaned closer, straining to hear more. "How?" Daniels asked. "The guy's under surveillance. His house is guarded, his family's gone, and he's probably in some bunker by now. That's why we make it look like an accident." The cold voice replied. "Something he can't trace back to us. A car crash, a robbery gone wrong, something clean." Miller grunted in approval. "About time we stopped playing games." James' heart pounded. He had heard enough. He stepped back from the door, ready to leave and take the recording straight to Russell. But as he turned, his foot knocked over a loose piece of metal. It clattered loudly against the pavement, the sound echoing in the still night. "Did you hear that?" Daniel said from inside. James froze, his pulse racing. He ducked behind the crates, holding his breath as the warehouse door creaked open. A beam of light from a flashlight swept across the lot. "Check it out," Miller ordered. Two men stepped out, their footsteps heavy on the gravel. James pressed himself against the crates, his mind racing. If they found him, this could end here and now. The beam of light passed dangerously close to where he crouched. James felt sweat trickle down his back as the men stopped just feet from his hiding spot. "Probably just a stray cat," one of them muttered. "Let's make sure," the other replied, his tone suspicious. James's hand tightened around his phone. If they discovered him, he had one shot to escape. His eyes darted to the darkened alley nearby. If he could make it there, he might have a chance. The men stepped closer, the flashlight beam sweeping over the crates. James prepared to move when a sudden noise distracted them. A loud clang from the other side of the lot. "What was that?" one of them asked, turning toward the noise. "Let's check it out," the other said. As they moved away, James silently thanked whoever or whatever had caused the noise. He waited until their footsteps faded, then slipped out of his hiding spot and darted back to his car. Once inside the safety of his vehicle, James pulled out his phone and called Russell. "Carter," Russell answered, his voice tense. "Where the hell are you?" "I'm at the warehouse," James said. "I have a recording. They're planning to kill me. Make it look like an accident." Russell swore. "Are you safe?" "For now," James said. "But they almost caught me." "Get out of there now," Russell ordered. "Send me the recording and I'll get a team on it. We'll move on them tonight." James nodded, though his hands were still shaking. He sent the file to Russell and started the car, his eyes scanning the darkened streets as he drove away. He didn't feel safe until he was miles from the warehouse. Later that night, as James sat in the safe house, his phone buzzed. It was Russell. "We got them," Russell said, his voice triumphant. "Daniels, Miller, and 3 others. The evidence you provided sealed the deal." James exhaled, relief washing over him. "What happens now?" "They'll be charged and suspended pending trial," Russell said. "But don't get too comfortable. If they were working with someone higher up, this isn't over." James nodded, his resolve hardening once again. "I didn't think it would be." As he ended the call, James felt a mix of victory and unease. He had taken a major step toward exposing the truth, but the fight was far from over. And somewhere in the shadows, he knew his enemies were already plotting their next move. The quiet of the safe house felt oppressive as James stared at his phone, rereading the message from Russell. The arrests of Daniels, Miller, and the others should have brought him relief, but instead it felt like the calm before an even darker storm. These men had been bold enough to act in public and leave traces. Whoever was pulling the strings in the background would be smarter and far more dangerous. James leaned back on the couch, his mind restless. He thought about Claire and Emily, who were still staying with Claire's sister. He had resisted the urge to call them, not wanting to bring his fear into their lives, but now he wondered if they were truly safe. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. James froze. The guard stationed outside would have alerted him if anyone had approached. His heart raced as he grabbed the small recording device from the coffee table and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" He called out, his voice steady. "It's me, Russell," came the reply. "Open up." James exhaled in relief, unlocking the door to find Russell standing there, his expression grim. "Didn't expect you to show up in person," James said, stepping aside to let him in. Russell entered, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." James sat down, gesturing for Russell to do the same. "What's going on?" Russell hesitated before speaking. "We interrogated Daniels and Miller. They're not talking yet, but we found something during the arrests, documents, encrypted emails. It points to someone higher up." James leaned forward. "Who?" "That's the problem," Russell said. "The emails are routed through proxies. It'll take time to trace them back to the source. But the language they used, the orders they gave, it's clear these men weren't acting on their own." "So the arrests were just the tip of the iceberg," James muttered. Russell nodded. "And there's something else. Miller had a list. Names, addresses, photos. Your name was on it, along with your family's." James's stomach dropped. "They know where Claire and Emily are?" "We don't think they've acted on it yet," Russell said quickly. "But we're moving them to a more secure location, just in case." James felt a surge of anger and fear. This isn't just a vendetta. This is a coordinated effort to protect something or someone. "Exactly," Russell said. "And until we know who's behind it, you and your family will remain targets." The next morning, James was relocated to a new safe house. This one was in an undisclosed location with tighter security, and Russell assured him it was impenetrable. But James couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. As he settled in, he received a call from Monica. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice tinged with worry. "A journalist has been trying to reach you. She says she has information about the case." James frowned. "Who is she?" "Her name's Rachel Grant. She's with the Tribune. She's been reporting on police corruption for years." James hesitated. Bringing in the media could either expose the truth or complicate things further. But if this journalist had credible information, he couldn't ignore it. Set up a meeting, he said. Somewhere public. That afternoon, James met Rachel Grant at a bustling cafe downtown. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a notepad and recorder in hand. She wasted no time getting to the point. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I've been following your case closely. The arrests last night confirmed what I've suspected for a while. There's a network within the police department, one that protects its own at any cost." "And you have evidence of this?" James asked. "I have sources," Rachel said. "Officers who've seen things but are too scared to come forward. And I have documents, internal memos, emails. They point to a man named Captain Leonard Steele." James's eyes narrowed. "Steele? I know that name." "He's the head of internal operations," Rachel explained. "Officially, he oversees officer conduct. Unofficially, he's been accused of covering up misconduct and silencing whistleblowers. Nothing's ever stuck, though. He's untouchable." James leaned back, processing the information. If Steele is involved, it explains the coordination. But how do we prove it? Rachel handed him a folder. "These are copies of the documents I've collected. It's not enough to convict him, but it's a start. If you're willing to go on record, we could expose this." James hesitated. "Going public could make things worse. They're already coming after me and my family." Rachel nodded. "I get it. But the longer Steele operates in the shadows, the more dangerous he becomes." James took the folder, his mind racing. "Let me think about it." That night, James reviewed the documents Rachel had given him. The evidence was compelling: internal emails, altered reports, and testimonies from anonymous sources. It painted a damning picture of Steele's influence. As he studied the files, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Stay out of this, or your family pays the price." James's anger boiled over. He was done being threatened. He called Russell. "Russell, we need to move on Steele," James said, his voice firm. "I've got evidence that ties him to this network." Russell was silent for a moment. "That's a dangerous move, Carter. Steele has connections everywhere." "I don't care," James snapped. "This ends now." Russell sighed. "All right, let's strategize. But if we do this, there's no turning back." The next day, James held a meeting with Russell and Rachel at the safe house. They laid out their plan: gather more evidence, secure witnesses, and prepare a public statement that would expose Steele's network. But as they finalized the details, the sound of gunfire shattered the air. Bullets tore through the windows, and James hit the floor as chaos erupted around him. "Get down," Russell shouted, drawing his weapon. Rachel screamed, clutching her notepad as she ducked under the table. James crawled toward his phone, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't waiting for him to make a move. They were taking the fight straight to him. And for the first time, James wondered if he had underestimated the enemy. The sharp crack of gunfire reverberated through the safe house, glass shattering and splintering into shards that rained onto the floor. James's ears rang as he crawled across the room, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Russell was already in action, shouting into his radio. "Shots fired. Safe house compromised. Request immediate backup." Russell's voice was steady but urgent. Rachel, crouched under the overturned table, clutched her notepad to her chest. Her eyes were wide with terror as she tried to keep her breathing quiet. James reached his phone and ducked behind a couch for cover. His fingers trembled as he dialed Claire's number. It rang twice before she picked up. "James?" Claire's voice was panicked. "What's going on?" "Stay where you are," James said, keeping his voice low. "Don't leave the house. I'll call you back when it's safe." Before she could respond, another round of bullets tore through the walls, forcing James to hang up abruptly. He peeked around the couch, trying to spot the shooters through the bullet-riddled windows. Shadows moved outside, their figures darting between cover. Russell crouched low, gesturing toward the back of the house. "We need to move now. They're trying to pin us down." James nodded, motioning for Rachel to follow. She hesitated, her fear evident, but eventually crawled toward him. Together, they crept toward the rear exit, staying low to avoid the gunfire. In the kitchen, Russell checked the back door, his gun drawn. "Clear for now," he whispered. "But they won't stop. We need to split up. Carter, take Rachel and head to the extraction point." "What about you?" James asked. "I'll hold them off," Russell said firmly. "Go. Now." James hesitated, but he knew Russell was right. He grabbed Rachel's arm and guided her out the back door. The cool night air hit them as they emerged into the alley behind the house. James glanced around, scanning for threats. "Stay close," he said to Rachel. They moved quickly, weaving through the shadows and sticking to narrow alleys. The sound of gunfire faded as they put distance between themselves and the safe house. James's heart pounded in his chest, every step feeling like a gamble. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the extraction point. A nondescript black SUV parked in a deserted lot. The driver, an agent in plain clothes, waved them over. "Get in," the agent hissed. James opened the door, helping Rachel inside before climbing in himself. The agent floored the gas pedal, and the SUV sped off, the tires screeching against the asphalt. "Where's Russell?" the agent asked, glancing at James through the rearview mirror. "He stayed behind to cover us," James replied, his voice tight. "We need to go back for him." The agent shook his head. "Negative. We have orders to get you to safety." James clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. He hated the thought of leaving Russell behind, but he knew the agent was right. For now, they had to focus on survival. The SUV took them to another safe house, this one in a more urban area, surrounded by high-rise buildings and heavy traffic. James barely had time to catch his breath before his phone buzzed. It was Russell. "I'm fine," Russell said before James could speak. They pulled back when reinforcements arrived. James exhaled in relief. "Are you sure you're safe?" "For now," Russell said. "But this attack confirms what we suspected. Steele knows we're onto him. He's not waiting for us to make the next move." James's jaw tightened. "Then we need to strike now." "I'm already working on it," Russell said. "But this will take precision. Steele isn't just going to roll over." James ended the call, his mind racing. He turned to Rachel, who was sitting on the couch, still shaken from the attack. "Are you okay?" he asked. Rachel nodded weakly. "I've covered dangerous stories before, but this is different." James sat beside her, his expression grim. "This is what we're up against. Steele and his people will do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Rachel took a deep breath, regaining some of her composure. "Then we can't stop now. We have to finish this." The next morning, Russell called again, his tone urgent. "We've located Steele's operations hub," he said. "An abandoned office building downtown. It's heavily guarded, but if we can get in, we might find enough evidence to take him down." James didn't hesitate. "I'm coming with you." "Carter, this isn't your fight anymore," Russell said. "You've done enough." "It's my fight until it's over," James said firmly. "I'm not backing down." Russell sighed. "Fine, but if you're coming, you follow my lead." That night, James and Russell prepared for the raid. They met with a small team of trusted agents, reviewing blueprints of the building and planning their approach. The tension in the room was palpable, each person aware of the risks. "Steele won't go down without a fight," Russell said. "Expect resistance." James nodded, his resolve unshakable. "Let's finish this." The raid began under the cover of darkness. The team moved swiftly and silently, breaching the building's perimeter and disabling the guards at the entrance. Inside, the air was thick with tension as they made their way through the dimly lit corridors. James's heart pounded as they approached the main office. Russell signaled for the team to stop, then motioned for James to stay back. Inside, voices echoed, a heated argument between Steele and another man. James strained to listen, catching fragments of their conversation. "We can't keep this quiet anymore," the other man said. "Carter's too close." "We'll deal with him," Steele replied coldly, "and anyone else who gets in our way." Russell nodded to the team, and they burst into the room, weapons drawn. "Freeze!" Russell shouted. "Hands where we can see them." Steele didn't hesitate. He grabbed a gun from his desk and opened fire, forcing the team to take cover. Chaos erupted as bullets tore through the room. James stayed low, his mind racing. This was it, the moment everything would be decided. The office erupted into chaos as Steele's gunfire shattered windows and ripped through furniture. James pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding as he tried to think clearly. He wasn't armed, but he wasn't helpless either. He clutched the small recording device in his pocket, knowing that if they survived this, evidence would be key. Russell's voice rang out over the noise. "Steele, drop your weapon. You're surrounded." "Not a chance," Steele barked, his voice filled with defiance. "You think you can bring me down? I've been cleaning up messes like this for decades." Another barrage of bullets forced Russell and his team to dive for cover. James peeked around the corner, catching a glimpse of Steele reloading behind his overturned desk. He could see the desperation in Steele's movements. He was cornered, but that made him even more dangerous. Russell motioned to one of his agents, who tossed a flashbang grenade into the room. The sudden burst of light and sound disoriented Steele, causing him to drop his weapon. Russell and two agents rushed in, pinning Steele to the floor as he struggled and cursed. "You're done, Steele," Russell said, his voice cold. "Am I?" Steele sneered. "You don't know the half of it." As Russell secured Steele's hands with zip ties, James entered the room cautiously. The other man who had been arguing with Steele was standing frozen near the window, his hands raised in surrender. "Who's this?" Russell asked, nodding toward the man. The man stammered, I'm just his accountant. I didn't know about all this." Russell motioned for an agent to take the man into custody. "We'll find out soon enough." James stepped closer to Steele, his anger boiling over. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not. We've got your people, your files, and now you." Steele laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You're a knave, Carter. Take me in, parade me in front of the cameras. It won't change anything. The system doesn't want change." James leaned down, meeting Steele's gaze. "We'll see about that." The team quickly swept the office, gathering evidence. Hard drives, paper files, and encrypted devices were packed into evidence bags. James noticed a folder on Steele's desk marked Project Blackline. He opened it, his stomach twisting as he read through the documents. "Russell, you need to see this," James said, handing him the folder. Russell's face darkened as he skimmed the pages. This isn't just about corruption. Steele was running an operation to suppress whistleblowers, fabricate evidence, and blackmail officials. James' mind raced. How far does this go? Russell shook his head. Farther than we thought. This could implicate people at every level of law enforcement and beyond. As they loaded Steele into a secure transport vehicle, James couldn't shake the weight of what they'd uncovered. Steele's network was massive, and dismantling it would require a relentless fight. But for the first time, James felt a flicker of hope. "We'll take this to the press," James said. "Let the public see the truth." Russell nodded. "We will. But be ready, Carter. If Steele's right and the system is as deep as he says, this fight is just getting started." James clenched his fists. "Then we keep fighting." Later that night, James returned to the new safe house, exhaustion pressing down on him like a heavy weight. His phone buzzed with a call from Claire. "James," she said, her voice filled with both relief and worry. "I saw the news. They arrested Steele." "It's a start," James replied. "But this isn't over." Claire was silent for a moment. "Emily misses you. So do I." "I miss you both too," James said, his voice softening. "Once this is over, I'll come home. I promise." "Just stay safe," Claire said. "We need you." James ended the call, his resolve solidifying. He couldn't stop now, not when so much was at stake. The next morning, the news broke. High-ranking police captain arrested in corruption probe. Steele's name and face were plastered across every channel, alongside details of his criminal network. Public outrage erupted, with protests demanding justice and accountability. But James knew the fight wasn't over. Steele's arrest was a victory, but the war against corruption and systemic injustice was far from won. As he stood by the window, watching the city wake up to a new day, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. Steele's network had been exposed, but the real battle to rebuild trust, demand accountability, and create lasting change was only beginning. And James was ready. The fallout from Steele's arrests swept through the city like a storm. Protests filled the streets, community leaders called for sweeping reforms, and journalists dug deeper into the tangled web of corruption Steele had overseen. The evidence seized during the raid revealed names, payments, and operations that implicated not only local officers but also high-ranking officials in other districts. James sat at a long table in a secure government briefing room, flanked by Agent Russell, Rachel Grant, and a small team of federal prosecutors. The air was tense with urgency as they pored over the files. "We've uncovered multiple layers of this operation," one prosecutor said, pointing to a board filled with photos and flowcharts. Steele wasn't just covering up misconduct, he was running a blackmail and bribery racket. This network reaches into state politics, private contractors, and even the judiciary. James rubbed his temples, the weight of the information pressing down on him. And yet Steele acted like a martyr, as if his downfall wouldn't matter. Russell nodded, because in some ways he's right. Cutting off one head of the operation doesn't dismantle the entire system. There are still people out there who will try to keep this alive. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Then we keep digging. The public is already on our side. This is the moment to strike. James met her gaze. And if we're wrong? If the system pushes back harder than we expect? Then we push harder, Rachel replied. We've got evidence, witnesses, and the momentum. This is a battle for the soul of justice. That afternoon, James returned to his office for the first time since the threats began. The building was surrounded by protesters holding signs that read, "Justice for all," "End corruption now," and "We stand with Carter." Monica greeted him at the door with a relieved smile. "It's good to have you back, Mr. Carter." "It's good to be back," James replied. He glanced at the stack of messages on his desk. "Anything urgent?" She nodded. "Several calls from community leaders asking how they can support you. And this." She handed him an envelope with no return address. James opened it cautiously, his heart sinking as he read the message inside. "You won this round, but we're still here. Watch your back." He set the note down, his resolve hardening. "File this with the others," he told Monica, "and double-check security protocols." The next few days were a whirlwind. James appeared on news programs, gave speeches, and met with advocacy groups. Each public appearance felt like walking a tightrope, drawing support while exposing himself to more danger. But he refused to back down. During one of these appearances, he stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing a crowd of reporters. "This isn't just about one man," James said, his voice firm. "Steele's arrest is a step toward justice, but the system that enabled him remains intact. We need systemic reforms, transparency, oversight, and accountability at every level." The crowd erupted in applause, but James' focus remained sharp. He knew the people listening weren't just supporters. They included those who wanted him silenced. That night, James returned to the new safe house, exhaustion etched into his face. Claire and Emily were waiting for him, having been cleared to return under strict protection. Emily ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Daddy, you're home." James knelt down, hugging her tightly. "I missed you, sweetheart." Claire watched them with a mix of relief and worry. When Emily went to bed, she turned to James. "How much longer can we live like this?" James sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't stop now. Not when we're this close." Claire sighed. "Just promise me you'll be careful. Emily needs her father." James nodded, though he knew the path ahead would only get more dangerous. 2 days later, a break came in the investigation. Russell called James with urgency in his voice. "We've decrypted the emails from Steele's files," Russell said. "They confirm what we suspected. There's a cabal of officials coordinating efforts to protect their interests. Judges, business leaders, even a state senator." James gripped the phone tightly. "Do we have enough to bring them down?" "Not yet," Russell replied. "But we're close. We need one more piece of evidence to link the cabal directly to Steele's operations." James thought for a moment. "What about Steele himself? Has he talked?" Russell hesitated. "He's been tight-lipped. But there's something else. We intercepted chatter about a meeting tonight. A group of Steele's allies are gathering to discuss their next steps." "Do you know where?" James asked. "Yes," Russell said. "But it's a trap. They'll expect us." "Which is why we need to go," James said. "If they're meeting, they'll have evidence with them." Russell sighed. "You're relentless, Carter." "Fine. But you're not going in alone." That night, James joined Russell and a tactical team outside a luxury penthouse downtown. The building was quiet, its lights casting long shadows across the street. "This is it," Russell said, handing James an earpiece. "We breach in 10. James nodded, his adrenaline surging. He knew this was the moment that could either break the case wide open or end in disaster. The team moved swiftly, entering the building and ascending to the penthouse. As they reached the door, Russell gave the signal, and the team burst in. Inside, a group of men sat around a table, their faces frozen in shock as the agents stormed the room. Papers and laptops cluttered the table, the evidence James had hoped for. One of the men, a silver-haired figure James recognized as Senator Wallace, stood, his face twisting in anger. "You have no right." Russell cut him off. "We have every right." Hands in the air. As the team secured the room, James scanned the documents on the table. One file caught his eye, a dossier detailing payments, threats, and cover-ups. It was the smoking gun they needed. But before he could grab it, Wallace shouted, "You'll regret this, Carter. You don't know who you're dealing with." James locked eyes with him, unflinching. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and your time is up." As they left the penthouse with the evidence in hand, James felt a surge of triumph, but he knew the battle wasn't over. The cabal was unraveling, but its remnants would fight back with everything they had. And James was ready for whatever came next. The following morning, the city woke to the explosive news of the raid. Every major network ran headlines about the high-profile arrests of Senator Wallace and the other officials at the penthouse meeting. The details of Steele's cabal were laid bare: bribery, blackmail, and a vast network of corruption designed to protect their interests at any cost. James stood in his office, watching the news coverage. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small smile. They had done it. The pieces were falling into place, and the people who had operated with impunity for so long were finally being held accountable. But his satisfaction was short-lived. Russell walked in, his expression grim. "What's wrong?" James asked, his guard immediately going up. Russell handed him a file. "We found this during the raid. It's a contingency plan, something Steele and his associates put together in case their network was compromised." James flipped through the file, his stomach tightening as he read. The plan detailed a coordinated effort to discredit him, using doctored evidence, planted witnesses, and even fabricated scandals. It was a final, desperate attempt to destroy his credibility and derail the investigation. "They're going to try to take you down," Russell said. "And they'll throw everything they have at you." James clenched his fists. "Let them. The truth is on our side." Russell nodded. "We'll counter every move they make. But you need to be prepared. This won't be easy." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. James worked closely with Russell, Rachel, and the legal team to ensure the evidence against Steele and his allies was airtight. At the same time, they braced for the inevitable counterattack. It came sooner than expected. A bombshell article appeared in a tabloid, accusing James of accepting bribes in exchange for leniency in previous cases. The story was filled with fabricated details and anonymous sources, but it spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with speculation, and the cable supporters used the opportunity to sow doubt about James's integrity. James sat in his office, the article displayed on his computer screen. Claire stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders. "This is their play," she said. "They're trying to make you look like the villain." James nodded. "And it won't work. The evidence speaks for itself." The next day, James held a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the podium, flanked by Rachel and Russell. "The accusations against me are baseless," James began, his voice steady. "They're a desperate attempt to shift focus away from the real criminals, those who have abused their power for years. I stand by the work we've done, and I will not be intimidated." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't just about me. It's about justice. It's about accountability, and no smear campaign will stop us from seeking the truth." The crowd erupted into applause, and James stepped back, letting Rachel take the microphone to discuss the evidence in more detail. As he watched, he felt a renewed sense of determination. They were winning the fight, but it wasn't over yet. Behind the scenes, Steele's former allies were beginning to turn on each other. Facing mounting evidence and the threat of long prison sentences, some began cooperating with investigators. Their testimonies provided crucial details about how the cable operated and implicated even more individuals. One by one, the pieces fell into place. The network of corruption that had seemed untouchable was unraveling, and its members were being brought to justice. Months later, James sat in a packed courtroom as the final verdicts were read. Steele, Wallace, and several other high-ranking officials were convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The sentences were harsh, reflecting the gravity of their crimes. As the judge delivered the final sentence, James felt a wave of relief. It was over. The cabal had been dismantled, and the city had taken its first steps toward real accountability. That evening, James returned home to Claire and Emily. The house was quiet, the air filled with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. Emily ran to him as he walked through the door, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Daddy, are you done working now?" she asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. James smiled, kneeling down to her level. "For now, sweetie. For now." Claire stood in the doorway, her expression soft. "You did it," she said. "We did it," James replied, pulling her into a hug. As they sat together that night, James reflected on everything they had endured. The threats, the attacks, the relentless fight for justice. It had all been worth it. But he knew the work wasn't finished. There were still systems to reform, policies to change, and communities to rebuild. The fight for justice was never truly over. But for the first time in a long time, James felt ready for whatever came next. He had faced the storm and emerged stronger, and he would continue to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in the power of truth.